And I'm going to start my timer to make sure I don't exceed the 20 minutes I said I would, as I've been doing the last couple times that I've been doing these segments of the tutorial. And I'm going to scroll down on our webpage, since this was actually a question that was asked, where do I find the tutorial? Here I am right at the top at Computer Science 20S. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, just past that little slideshow picture to where it says remote learning assignments. And I'm going to open up, first of all, this. That's the instruction document. That's the set of instructions to do the tutorial. And I'm going to open up this, which is a PDF of all the code, not the instructions, but just the code. So that I don't necessarily have to type the code. I can copy and paste it over from the PDF as I follow through the instructions. So I'm going to open both of those, okay? The PDF of the code and the instructions. We've already done that the last 2 days, but I'm just reminding you that's where they are. And we'll go back to where we left off yesterday. So there's the PDF of the code. There's the instructions. So yesterday we did all this. We made our design. We named everything in the last 2 days. We entered all this code right here. All this code was entered, okay? The create button. And we got working on the start button, but we didn't actually finish the start button yet. So if I scroll through the code here, we can kind of get to page 3 of that PDF, which is about where we left off. Or let's just take a look right here. So yes, we did our design. The design was completed on the first day of this tutorial. And then by the second day, we were not only, we just made sure that the design was all named. There was names for all the objects. And then we started applying more of the code by day 2, which was yesterday. So we did the design, and by day 2 yesterday, we started putting in the code, including our comments and the global variables and the form load code and the create code. And what we learned yesterday is that this now incorporated new material that you hadn't learned in the previous 4 units on this concept of looping. And that looping is like conditional statements. It just forces the code to keep repeating itself. Just as a side note, before we get too far into this, we started this course working in Scratch. You might remember. Scratch is awesome, but it only goes so far in terms of its learning ability in a high school computer science course, right? You can't obviously get a job as a game developer with Scratch alone, but Scratch is an awesome tool to start building the building blocks of what computer science is. So you should never really give up on Scratch. It's awesome. But you might remember when we were in that section called control of Scratch, we had these blocks like this one, forever, and maybe even this one, repeat, that had those little arrows at the bottom. Those blocks represent loops. As a matter of fact, this one here that says forever, I'm just going to block part of it, works perfectly for what we saw yesterday was this thing called a for loop. For like forever, okay? So the for loop is a little bit more of a technical looking loop than the while loop, but it is a loop that can also be used to do programming and to repeat itself. And what we had here was we had a for loop and then a second for loop inside of the first for loop. You might remember that idea is called nesting, when you nest one thing inside of the other thing. We learned that in the conditional statements unit, where you could nest an if statement inside of an if statement. Well, you can nest a loop inside of a loop. You can nest a loop inside of an if statement. You get the idea. You can nest these different control structures in ways that kind of help build it. And this is essentially what we did, by the way. Like you're seeing Scratch here. But if I go to one of our first assignments, one of our first Scratch assignments back in Unit 1. So I'm going to go back to the assignments and back to Unit 1. And I'll go to our second Scratch assignment. You might remember it was that sort of Super Mario simulator. It wasn't Super Mario, but you get the idea. And I'm just going to go to the last page of these instructions, which had all that code on it, all those code blocks. And right here, you can see here's that loop. with a conditional statement and then another conditional statement nested inside of it. You see a variable right here, vertical velocity. So it was in that first unit that I was showing you guys, even before we started programming, what was coming up in this course. It was like a little breadcrumbs leading you towards where we would eventually get in this course. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I didn't get the time to teach you looping I normally would, but that's what this tutorial is going over, the idea of these loops. Okay, so that's pretty good. So now today we've coded the create button. And by the way, let's see how that runs. Just as a reminder from yesterday, if I select 58 prizes, it will create 58 unique prize values. So 58 numbers, none of which are the same. So from from 1 to I think it's 200 different numbers there. Okay. So we're going to start today, not in Scratch, but in our instructions by coding the start button. That's the button we haven't coded yet. So start the game. Okay, so this is now where we're going to put our code for the next part of this tutorial. So it's really handy to have the PDF of that code open. So it starts on page 3, as I said. So starting on page 3, here you can see it says button start. And I'm going to grab just the first part of this whole if statement up here. Not the else, but just the if. And before I grab it, let's just sort of read what it says it's going to do. It's going to check to make sure that at least one, oh, wait a minute. I'm not sharing my screen with you guys, am I? I just realized that. Holy moly. I'm sorry, I had not been realizing that whole time I hadn't been sharing my screen for like 8 minutes. I hadn't been sharing my screen. You've just been looking at my stupid face for 8 minutes. All right. Oh my goodness. You know what? I think, yeah, I'm just going to quickly go over a little bit more what I said because it's on the video. That I'm opening the instruction document and the PDF of the code. Here's the instruction document. Here's the PDF of the code. Here's all that code from yesterday, including the for loop. You guys didn't see what I was saying on Scratch, so I'm just going to quickly reopen the closed tabs I had open. That when we were working on that second Scratch assignment, you can now see that I had a forever block with an if block, with another if block, with a variable. That's what I meant by nesting, and that's what I meant by the variable itself. I'm sorry, did somebody, by the way, mention to me that I wasn't sharing my screen? No, nobody said anything in the chat. Nobody said anything in the speakers. So that tells me how much you guys are paying attention to this right now. Maybe I'm being a little hard on you. Okay. So now let's get back to the tutorial. All right. So where we left off yesterday is we are going to code the start the game button. We're going to start by putting some code into this button, start the game, by going to the PDF of just the code. And on page 3 of this PDF, we're on page 3. I'm going to use just this first part of the if statement right here. So I'm going to select it. Notice I'm selecting the curly brackets, the start of the if statement, and I'm even selecting the comment, although that's not completely necessary. And I'm going to paste it in there. Okay? So this part of the if statement checks to make sure at least one prize value is in that list box, so that they've at least created one prize value. They can't do it with 0. Okay? And if they haven't, it's going to pop up a message box. Let me show you what I mean by this. If they have not yet created the prize values, because I don't know how many prize values they're going to go seek out in this game, right? So if they try and start the game without putting anything in there, it's going to say generate values first. So I'd have to generate at least one prize value. Then that message box will not appear. So that's what that if statement or that conditional statement is doing. Now we get to the else, and here's where you guys as students need to make a decision. What mark do you want to get up to in this tutorial? Because this is a spot where you can now end your tutorial, as it says in this comment right here. It says, if you want, you can complete this tutorial at this point for a mark up to 70% max. So at this point, if you want, you can just finish, I think, about 4 or 5 more lines of code, and you could hand in this tutorial and get up to 70%. Now I say up to because that would mean that, you know, it works and your comments are there and stuff like that. So if you do everything right, you could get 70% on this unit at this point. So that's a great deal, I think, especially for those of you who are struggling. You could get this entire tutorial done right now at this point today and get a 70 on it. However, for those who want to push higher in your mark, then you have to finish the whole tutorial, okay? Or at least higher than 70 would be the rest of the tutorial after this. So you have a choice right now. Which of these things are you going to do? If you're one of those students who's not continuing, in other words, you know, this is good enough, then this is the only line that you're going to need to put in your else statement right there. So in other words, what you would do is you would type else, and then you'd put application dot exit, code you've done before in this class. And if that's what you want, that's where this tutorial would end for you, right there, because you have done both types of loops. And so therefore, I'm happy if this works properly and is perfectly done to give you a 70% on this tutorial at this point. For those who want higher than 70%, you would have to finish the rest of the tutorial. But that's where the choice comes. So all this code that you see here would not need to be done. You would not need to do this code if you're happy with that 70%. A application.exit, and that's all you'd need to do. For those who are continuing, okay, it says don't do the next section yet, okay? It says before you code this next section down here, it tells you what to do, okay? This is also in, I believe, the instructions, where it says how you're going to add something to your project right now. So I'm going to show you how to do that, okay? So this would be, and I'm going to put in a comment here, for those 70%, and again, I got to clarify, up to 70%, this tutorial, you can stop here. I'll talk about handing it in next week. So that's for those who want up to 70%, okay? If you are good with it, that's where you could be done right there. However, for those wanting more than 70%, potentially, keep going, okay? You're gonna keep going. That means you have to comment that line out or don't write that line of code. Don't write it. So don't write the line above. Comment it out. Okay? So now we're at this spot right here. Okay? So for those who want more than 70%, you would now add more code, but you're not supposed to add code yet, because what it says is before you code it, the next section, here's what you're going to need to do. Okay, and let's do it together. You can see it on the instructions right here. And what you're going to do is you're going to go in your Visual Studio. You're going to go to Project, and you're going to add something called a class. Very simply, a class is a place where you can put code, but there's no design part to it. It's just a spot where you can put code. This is a simple explanation of what it is. In the grade 11 computer science course, classes is an entire unit of study. So this is just a little look ahead at some of the stuff coming up if you were to take Computer Science 30S. Now, when you say add class, it's going to ask you to give it a name. Like, what am I going to name this class? And as you look in the tutorial, the name you're going to give it is globals, because that's what it is. It's going to be a place where we're going to put some global variables. Very importantly, you'll notice the G of globals is capitalized, and that's important because that's also going to show up in the code. So that's what I'm going to call it, globals. .cs. CS just means it's a C# file. So globals is the name of this class. And then just click add. What it's now going to do is it's going to add a third tab up here. We have the tab for Form 1, a tab for its design, and now a tab for globals. Remember, there is no design with this. It's just a place for code. Okay, so you can see here, it's just code. All right, so now what am I going to add to that? Well, you can see it's down here. There's not much code we're going to add. It's just this here. If you get rid of the comments, it's really just 4 lines of code that you're going to put in there. But you don't have to type it. You can go over and scroll down the PDF, remembering that you're going to have to come back in a minute, down here to globals. And I'm going to grab not only the 4 lines of code, but I'm going to grab all the comments as well. I'm going to copy it. And importantly, you need to know where to put it. You're putting it between this curly bracket and this curly bracket. So you're going to give yourself some space right here. Code is indented as well. And you're going to paste it in there. Okay? It's important you saw exactly where that went, because I wouldn't want you guys to put it in the wrong spot. It could end up causing errors. So I'm sort of pausing here for a second so that if you're watching this video later, you could pause the video to make sure that you are getting it between that curly bracket and that curly bracket. Now, what this essentially means is we've added words like public and static here, which essentially just these words mean that these variables are really global. They're shared amongst multiple forms, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to have more than one form here. So it's not only global variables, but they're really global variables to store how many prizes I collect, to score, how many total prizes there are, how many prizes I collect as the hero, how many prizes my enemy collects. And then this thing down here is a look ahead at another Computer Science 30S concept. So it's absolutely nothing you would have been expected to know in this course. But for those moving ahead, it is something that is shown in Computer Science 30S, and it's called an array. It's something that's studied also in an entire unit in the Computer Science 30S course. Okay, so that's done. So now what I'm going to need to do is I need to go back to the code I skipped over before. This code that, for those who are continuing, I'm going to use. So I'm going to grab not only this code, this first line, which is to modify the global variable in the globals class, but also there's a loop. And then there's some other stuff here about creating a form that I'm going to need to do. But we're very short on time here based on my timer. And I know I wasted a couple minutes at the beginning because I forgot to turn my screen sharing on. But you know what we have next week as well. So I'm not going to grab all of this code. All I'm going to grab is up to, up to here. So I'm going to start at this piece of the comment and end on that curly bracket, because this part down here would require a little more work from the instructions. So we'll leave that for Monday. But I'm going to copy that code I'm going to go back to form 1 and I'm going to paste it in there. Okay, so you can see that there. You can hear my timer going off in the background. So real quick before I wrap up today, I'm going to play this. This time I'm going to actually select a number, create the unique prize values, and start the game, right? So start the game, okay? We'll eventually use this code to move to the next section that we'll be working on next week. So my code still works with me adding in this section right here that I brought over from the PDF, which also uses another loop, another looping structure. We'll talk a little, so what we'll do on Monday is I'll start by discussing what this code did. Okay, so you kind of have a feel for it. And then we'll move on to the next section from there. Remember, for those of you who wanted that 70%, as I said, this could have been done today as well. Okay, I am going to now stop the video.